This video is brought to you by Squarespace, the all-in-one website platform. More about them later in the video. Welcome back to Biographics. I'm your host, Eric Malachite, and today's script was provided by Larry Holsworth, so be sure to show some love in the comments to him as you deploy your likes and do the rest of that stuff that keeps the eldritch beast that is the YouTube algorithm going. Let's get to it. It was either bad luck or destiny for German General Friedrich Paulus to be assigned to command the German 6th Army at the pivotal Battle of Stalingrad in 1942 through 1943. Though he was a career soldier, he assumed that command with no experience commanding a unit larger than a battalion, or roughly 1,000 troops. The 6th Army and associated units comprised over 300,000 men. Despite his inexperience and a severely flawed plan ordered by Adolf Hitler, who considered himself smarter than all of his generals, Paulus succeeded in capturing most of Stalingrad, only to lose it again to Soviet forces, which vastly exceeded his troops in numbers. For inexplicable reasons, many histories identify Friedrich Paulus as Friedrich von Paulus, including in discussions of the military operations on the Eastern Front during World War II. He was not born of the German or Prussian nobility, as von implies, and there is no evidence of his ever using the honorific when referring to himself. When and where the misidentification began is unknown, but it has continued among some writers and documentary producers to the present day. It is incorrect, though. Paulus came from a relatively humble, albeit comfortable family. Having survived Hitler, the Nuremberg trials, and Soviet captivity, Paulus later became a leading proponent for the reunification of Germany, though he envisioned a Germany with a decidedly less United States bend and influence. His life was one of many tragedies and failures, though it was marked by his dedication to Germany both between the world wars and in the aftermath. Nonetheless, he remains known mainly as the general who surrendered to the Soviets at Stalingrad, one of the major turning points of the Second World War. Friedrich Paulus was raised in Kassel in the German state of Hesse-Nassau, a province of the Kingdom of Prussia. Born on September 23, 1890, he first wanted to enter the Imperial Navy. Great Britain, the German Reich, France, and Italy were all engaged in major naval expansions in the late 19th and early 20th century. The Imperial Navy carried an air of panache not as readily found in land-based military units, other than some elite cavalry commands. Most of the officer corps for the Kaiser's fleet came from the nobility, and unfortunately the young Paulus failed in his quest to earn a cadetship in the Navy. He then tried the law, studying at Marburg, but found the study of law unexciting and eventually left school without obtaining a degree. Friedrich finally earned a cadetship with the 111th Infantry Regiment of the Imperial Army, his service beginning in February 1910. A friend within the regiment introduced the young officer cadet to his sister, Constance Rossetti Salescu. The couple were married in a military wedding on July 4, 1912. His new bride was a Romanian, also of relatively humble birth. Together, they had 3 children, beginning with twin sons born in 1918. They named them Ernst Alexander and Friedrich Ephraim Paulus. They also had a daughter, Olga, and eventually both sons followed their father into the German army. In August 1914, at the outset of World War I, the 111th was one of the many regiments mustered to invade France through the Low Countries, and Paulus saw his first military actions in the region of the Vosges, near the German-French border. He took ill during actions around Arras, where heavy fighting claimed a stunning number of lives in the first year of the war. After leave to recover, Paulus requested he be assigned to the Alpenkorps, a newly formed military unit comprised of elite troops trained to fight and operate in the mountains. Alpenkorps units trained in fighting in mountain passes and valleys, often on snowshoes or skis, rappelled down mountains and were considered some of the finest troops in the Kaiser's army. The young officer took to the new unit and its difficult mission. During the remainder of the war, he fought in the French Alps and in the rugged mountains of Serbia and Romania. By the time of the armistice in 1918, he had achieved the rank of captain and was well regarded by his commanders and his fellow officers, as well as the men under his command. If you want your business to be as successful as the Allies were in crushing their enemies in World War II, then you're going to need a snazzy website. And the sponsor for today's video, Squarespace, has you covered. Squarespace is the all-in-one website platform perfect for entrepreneurs and hobbyists alike. Recently, I needed to make a simple website for a tabletop RPG I'm developing and playtesting to make looking through the monster of a rulebook easier, and it was beyond simple to add sections, format, and even incorporate my existing knowledge of CSS and HTML, though you don't need any knowledge in that area at all. And it's all thanks to Squarespace's innovative Fluid Engine. The Fluid Engine makes it easier than ever for pretty much anyone to dive in and make a beautiful website. Answer a few questions about the goals you'd like to accomplish with your site, choose a template, and get dragging and dropping elements onto your template. Drag and drop technology is also included in every Squarespace site. But that's not all, because if you're working on a long-term project like the tabletop RPG I just mentioned, Squarespace makes it easy for you to create members-only content for your community. Monetize your projects by selling access to online courses, blogs, videos, and memberships. Start with a fully customizable website and earn recurring revenue by gating your content behind a paywall. Simply set the price and choose whether to charge a one-time fee or subscription for access. And then you can use Squarespace email campaigns to make it easy for you to spread the word about your project, engage clients, promote your services, and grow your business. Plus, if you're as busy as I am, you can even set up email automations to stay connected, nurture leads, and save time. Ready to get started? Head to squarespace.com/biographics for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, use offer code Biographics to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Now, back to your regularly scheduled programming. The post-war Treaty of Versailles imposed harsh conditions on Germany, particularly regarding its military. Its navy was severely reduced and its army was limited to 100,000 men, with an officer corps of just 4,000. It is perhaps an indication of the regard with which Paulus was held by his superiors that he was selected to remain in the new defensive army, called the Reichswehr, where he held no social or political connections to recommend him. In the 1920s and the tumultuous period of the Weimar Republic, Paulus held several staff positions of increasing responsibility and often addressed professional military gatherings in Germany, the Soviet Union, and even the United Kingdom. In 1933, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party rose to power, and the rearming of Germany began in earnest. Paulus became an early and vocal proponent of armored formations, the Panzerwaffe, which would become a critical component of German military tactics in the opening months of the Second World War. In early 1938, he was assigned to the 16th Army Corps under Heinz Guderian. Guderian found his new underling creative and talented, but he expressed concern over Paulus's lack of command experience. Paulus remained with Guderian until May 1939, when he was assigned to 10th Army as Chief of Staff. He was with that unit when it took part in the invasion of Poland in September. Following the subjugation of Poland, the 10th Army was redesignated as 6th Army, and under that name it participated in the invasions of the Low Countries and France in 1940. In August, Paulus was promoted to Major General and assigned as Deputy Chief of Staff to the German General Staff. In that new role, he began to assist in the development of plans for the invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Otto. Though regarded as a talented administrator and planner, he still had not to that point in his career commanded any unit larger than a battalion. Intensive planning for the long-anticipated German invasion of the Soviet Union began in 1940 under the codename of Operation Otto, later changed to Barbarossa. Named after a 12th century Holy Roman Emperor Friedrich Barbarossa, the operation was on a massive scale. More than 3.8 million German troops took part, and well over 6,000 armored vehicles, up to 5,000 aircraft, and over 23,000 pieces of artillery. An interesting aspect of the war, often forgotten, is that the German army relied on more than 600,000 horses and mules to tow their heavy equipment and supplies. Another 600,000 vehicles of all types supported the invasion. The Germans planned an attack along a front that stretched 2,900 kilometers, with three main army groups pushing into the Soviet Union. In the north toward Leningrad, in the center toward Moscow, and in the south across Ukraine. In their planning, Hitler assigned little importance to the capture of Moscow, demanding his forces concentrate on the entrapment and destruction of the Soviet armies rather than the acquisition of territory. In his mind, territorial gains would follow. The planning sessions were contentious. In general, Army Group North was tasked with the capture of Leningrad and the destruction of the Soviet defensive forces there. Army Group Center, the most heavily armored of the three main groups, was to strike through Smolensk to Moscow. Paulus's role in the preparations was to analyze the plan submitted by the senior staff, determine the results of each phase, and to report the results to high command. His findings often disputed those of his seniors, since he based his analysis on continuous Soviet resistance rather than the rout encountered on the Western Front in 1940. As a senior staff officer, Paulus did not anticipate he would be tasked with commanding fighting forces at the front, and in the initial planning, Barbarossa did not include an attack on Stalingrad. Army Group South was split into two forces, tasked with driving through Kiev to the Volga and the Caucasus. The attack, launched on June 22, 1941, stunned the world, despite Hitler's long-publicized contempt for the Soviet Union and the ethnicities that populated it. Newspaper headlines and newsreels told of the massive casualties inflicted on the Soviets and the huge gains recorded by the German army, which appeared to the world to be unbeatable. The Soviets suffered nearly 4.5 million military casualties in Barbarossa alone, and it was merely the opening phase of the long war of attrition on the Eastern Front. Whole Soviet air fleets were smashed while still on the ground. The aircraft that did get airborne found they were no match for the modern fighters of the Luftwaffe. Long columns of refugees fleeing the advancing Germans clogged Soviet roads. Factories were bombed, as were cities. The Soviet army appeared to melt before the German onslaught in many areas, though hard fighting occurred in many others. Casualties were heavy as the Soviets withdrew eastward. Yet, despite its scale and the military victories attained, Barbarossa was a failure. Army Group North reached Leningrad, where it bogged down in one of the epic sieges of human history. Army Group Center came close enough to Moscow that its advanced units reported seeing the spires of the Kremlin before weather, supply shortages, and Soviet resistance forced them back. By late 1941, German advances had been halted on all fronts. Additionally, shortages of oil were beginning to be felt. Hitler fired his overall commander, Field Marshal Walter von Brauch, and assumed command of the Eastern Front himself. In November 1941, Field Marshal Walter von Reichenau was relieved of command of the German 6th Army and assigned overall command of the Army Group South. The latter was composed of the 6th Army, Panzer Group 1, the 17th Army made up of Slovakian and Hungarian troops, the Italian Expeditionary Corps, the 3rd and 4th Romanian armies, and the Luftwaffe 4 providing aerial support. Von Reichenau was a longtime mentor of Friedrich Paulus, and despite Paulus lacking experience with a major command, he was assigned as commander to the 6th Army. Von Reichenau suffered a stroke on January 14, 1942. He was flown to Leipzig for medical care, but his aircraft crashed in Lemberg en route, and he died of his injuries. Paulus took command of the 6th Army the following week, inexperienced and no longer able to rely on his patron. In late winter, Adolf Hitler decided to concentrate the German efforts in the coming summer to a thrust deeper into the Soviet Union at Stalingrad, an industrial city on the Volga River, which controlled access to the Caucasus oil fields. The capture of Stalingrad would also make the delivery of Lend-Lease supplies through the Persian corridor more difficult, if not impossible. The new offensive was designated Case Blue. Hitler ordered Army Group South, then in eastern Ukraine, split into two entities. Group B, under General Maximilian von Weichs, consisted of Paulus's 6th Army and the 4th Panzer Army. It was their task to seize and hold Stalingrad. The other units, Group A, were to advance into the Caucasus. Under Paulus, operations of the 6th Army began well, opening the drive towards Stalingrad in June 1942. However, meddling by Hitler, who considered himself a master strategist and tactician, a very stable genius, led to delays as he reassigned units and caused massive transportation problems as a result. Despite the interventions of the Führer, the Germans under Paulus reached the Don River in late July, about 65 kilometers from the Volga. There they established supply depots on the Don's west bank before pushing on toward the Volga and Stalingrad. By August, Soviet resistance around the Volga was stiffening, and Army Group A had extended too far into the Caucasus to support Paulus and his command. As the Germans neared the city itself, Stalin ordered the evacuation of food and railway cars from the city, but refused to allow the civilian population to leave. Instead, he demanded the factories supporting the Soviet war effort continue in production, which they did until overrun by the Germans. The German Luftwaffe bombed the city in major raids, creating massive destruction and mounds of rubble. Meanwhile, the Soviets massed reinforcements on the east bank of the Volga outside the city. The Battle of Stalingrad was one of the largest of the Second World War and universally regarded as the turning point of the war in Europe. It was long, brutal, and featured urban warfare as the Soviets and Germans fought from bombed-out building to bombed-out building. Soviet snipers took a heavy toll of German officers. The Luftwaffe pounded Soviet positions and disrupted placement columns and supply attempts. Outside the city, along the German flanks, combat was equally brutal, with neither side willing to give ground or mercy. By September, the largely destroyed city was the scene of brutality on both sides. Soviet civilians were forced into battle, often without weapons, and they would be ordered to find one on their own. On the Soviet side, deserters or those deemed to be shirkers or cowards were summarily shot. By the end of September, the Germans had gained control of the southern part of the city, but the Soviets continued to hold the north end and center area, including the ferry routes across the Volga, essential to resupply and reinforce their troops. Those ferrying across did so under German shelling and aerial attacks. Meanwhile, more and more Soviet reinforcements arrived in the area. At Stalingrad, Paulus essentially led 6th Army to find its way into a trap, where Soviet counterattacks ensured there could be no escape. Yet he was under orders to capture and hold the city, and he followed his orders to the limits of his and his men's ability. Through the autumn, German advances continued. By the end of November, the Germans controlled most of the city, reducing Soviet control to a small area along the banks of the Volga. By then, the massive Soviet counterattacks, which included against Army Group Center far to the north, as well as against Group A along the Don River, ensured that getting relief to the 6th Army in Stalingrad was improbable at best. By the end of November, Paulus and the 65,000 men under his command were surrounded by Soviet troops, which, unlike the Germans, were well equipped for winter offensive operations. German Field Marshal Erich von Manstein advised Hitler that Paulus should remain where he was rather than attempt a breakout. Instead, von Manstein would break through to relieve Paulus. At the same time, Field Marshal Hermann Göring told Hitler that his Luftwaffe was capable of meeting the supply needs of the beleaguered 6th Army. Neither was correct. The Luftwaffe could only deliver about 100 tons of supplies per day, while the troops in Stalingrad required over 500 tons daily at a minimum. On December 19, 1942, the Luftwaffe delivered 262 tons, its greatest effort during the entire battle. Most days, only about 85 tons were flown in. The returning flights evacuated wounded as well as technical experts labeled essential by the German commands. And von Manstein had little chance of breaking through the double cordon of Soviet positions which had surrounded Stalingrad. One of the wounded evacuated as the situation grew increasingly dire was Captain Ernst Paulus, according to some sources. Others dispute this, claiming that Ernst had been wounded at Kharkov and did not take part in the Stalingrad battle. At any rate, Ernst returned to Germany, where he and his mother faced arrest by the Gestapo later in the year. Paulus's other son, Friedrich Ephraim, was killed at the Allied invasion of Anzio in Italy in 1944. Despite the desperate predicament facing his command, Paulus recognized the need to continue fighting since it tied down Soviet troops, which would otherwise be used in other winter counteroffensives. He steadfastly refused to disobey Hitler's orders, despite urgings of his officers and others that they attempt a breakout to meet up with von Manstein's advancing troops. One factor dominating his thinking was the lack of fuel available for his tanks and armored vehicles. Without a resupply, he could move no further than 30 kilometers. On December 23rd, attempts to relieve Stalingrad via a ground attack through the surrounding Soviet forces were abandoned. Army Group A was also ordered to withdraw from its positions in the Caucasus, leaving Paulus and 6th Army to its fate. There was no reaching the storage depots they had prepared on the Don the preceding summer. On January 7, 1943, Paulus, his troops exhausted and starving, requested permission to surrender, and Hitler refused, ordering Paulus to fight to the last man. The High Command informed Paulus, every day that the army holds out longer helps the whole front and draws away the Russian divisions from it. He held out for just over 3 more weeks. On the night of January 21st and the 22nd, the Soviets overran the last airfield capable of receiving supply flights. Soviet troops pressed into the remains of the city, again engaging the Germans in bloody urban warfare, though the issue was no longer in doubt. By January 30th, the German defenders were split into 3 pockets of resistance, with little coordination between them. With his army split into isolated pockets and no communications between them, Paulus held the title of commander, but no coherent command structure. Paulus notified Hitler that his troops were likely to give out in a matter of hours. The Führer responded by promoting him to Field Marshal, noting that no Prussian or German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. The implication was clear. Hitler expected Paulus to commit suicide rather than surrender. Whether Paulus surrendered or was overrun and captured by Soviet troops is disputed. Hitler, however, did not dispute it. When informed of the fall of Stalingrad and the capture of over 91,000 surviving German troops, Hitler ranted against Paulus, noting he could have ascended into eternity and national immortality, but he prefers to go to Moscow. During the entire Stalingrad campaign, approximately 235,000 Axis troops, mostly Germans, were captured by the Soviets. The surrender of Stalingrad included 22 generals, further enraging Hitler, who blamed his generals for the alarming failures on the Eastern Front. The casualties were staggering, with over 300,000 killed, wounded, or captured from 6th Army alone, according to some estimates. Of the 91,000 survivors who surrendered with Paulus, less than 6,000 ever saw Germany again. The rest either died on the march to Soviet prisoner of war facilities or while in captivity. Paulus prepared himself to be captured by the Soviets rather than consider the alternative Hitler preferred. As a devout Roman Catholic, he did not consider suicide an option at all. After the event, Paulus told General Max Pfeffer, another German officer captured at Stalingrad, "I have no intention of shooting myself for this Bohemian corporal." On one of the last supply evacuation flights out of Stalingrad, he sent his wife a letter along with his wedding ring. He had not seen her since departing to assume command of the 6th Army, and he would never see her again. Paulus spent the rest of 1943 and the first half of 1944 resisting attempts by the Soviets to gain his cooperation producing anti-Nazi propaganda while a prisoner of war near Moscow. Though never an ardent Nazi himself, he considered such collaboration with the enemy beneath him as a German officer. In July 1944, Operation Valkyrie attempted to kill Hitler and overthrow his government. In its aftermath, numerous German military officers and civilian officials were purged by the vengeful Führer. The attempted coup and Germany's steadily declining fortunes in the war induced Paulus to join the Bund Deutscher Offizier, or League of German Officers, known as the BDO. The anti-Nazi organization was founded among captured German officers and sponsored by their Soviet captors. The BDO developed and delivered anti-Nazi propaganda to German troops. Some officers worked with their Soviet captors to interrogate newly arrived prisoners. Following the war, several of its members were tried as war criminals, including its founder, Walter von Seydlitz-Korba, another Stalingrad prisoner. On August 8, 1944, Paulus signed a statement which read in part, "I consider it my duty to declare that Germany must remove Adolf Hitler and install a new state leadership." He later confirmed writing the statement as a witness for the Soviets at the Nuremberg trials, where he repeated the statement during testimony before Hermann Göring, Alfred Jodl, William Keitel, and other Nazi leaders. He remained in Soviet custody until 1953, where he was allowed to travel to East Germany. During his captivity, his wife of 41 years died. During the last months of the war, she had been taken into Gestapo custody due to her husband's collaboration with the Soviets. Released at the end of the war, she lived in the American zone of West Germany, cared for by her son Ernst. Whether she had any communication with her husband during his captivity is unknown. In 1953, Paulus returned to Germany and the German Democratic Republic. He spoke out against the division of Germany and the strong influence of the United States and its allies in West German politics. He argued for the reunification of Germany, with a strong orientation to the Eastern Bloc, and also advocated for restoring normal relations with France. He did not espouse communism, though he reiterated in speeches and writings his support for German unity and German self-direction, rather than what he perceived as its being pulled by outside forces from the USSR and USA. He settled in Dresden, where he worked at the East German Military History Research Institute as its civilian head. In 1955, he began to notice some weakening in his muscles and experienced difficulties with his speech. In 1956, he was diagnosed with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, known in America as Lou Gehrig's disease. Just as there was no cure then, there is no cure now. Friedrich Paulus died in Dresden on February 1st, 1957, at the age of 66. It was 14 years and a day after his surrender to the Soviet Union at Stalingrad. His will directed that his body be shipped to Baden-Baden in West Germany, where he was interred next to the grave of his wife. His sole surviving son, Ernst Paulus, committed suicide in Germany in 1970 at the age of 52, the same age his father had been when he surrendered at Stalingrad. I hope you learned something today, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to deploy your likes, comment a historical figure we haven't covered yet, subscribe, and ring that bell, and share this video with someone who loves learning about historical figures. I'm Eric Malachite, and we'll see you next time